Thank you, Ms. Doris. Thank you, Brandon. And thank you, Patrice. Words have not come easily this week. The funeral of an old true friend. The ambush shooting of a police officer on patrol. The murder of a 17-year-old lad that many of us loved. Those are the events that cause words to stick in our throats and to fail us. Words don't come easily when there's no sense to be made of the loss that we feel and the pain that defies understanding. Words feel almost useless, though we know otherwise. Well, we think or we hope we know otherwise. I read some inaugural addresses in hopes of helping me with my words. I know it sounds a strange thing to do in a time of grief, I'm sure, but no one's ever accused me of being normal. So after all, there are some whose inaugural words, their first words, came at some of the most difficult times in the history of the world. That's the way I thought of it anyway. And so I read President Teddy Roosevelt's words after the assassination of President William McKinley. I read President Franklin Roosevelt's words that came in the face of a Great Depression. I remember he said, "We have nothing to fear except fear itself." It was a wonderful sentiment, but I'm not certain that it was accurate. There's President Abraham Lincoln's first words. They were spoken in the face of a great civil war. There's, of course, President Kennedy's first words. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. President Reagan's first words facing historical inflation, a gas shortage and such. He simply told us that it was time to act. There was President Obama's inaugural address, that historic moment when the first person of color to become the president of the United States took the oath of office. And his first words were, "My fellow citizens, I stand here today humbled by the task before us, grateful for your trust you've bestowed, and mindful of the sacrifices borne by our ancestors." You know, there's some great words in those first words. And I went further abroad too. I read Nelson Mandela's first words and Winston Churchill's first words as prime minister. I've read almost all of Archbishop Desmond Tutu's first words at the start of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and even Jane Addams' famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, first words when she was at Carnegie Hall in 1915. I read a lot of words in these last couple of days. And one of the things that I noticed in all those words and all those first words, those inaugural words, is that they tend to give us deep insight into the speaker. We catch a glimpse of their focus in their new role that they're accepting, or their situation that they and their country are facing, or the thing that they value most. With some of those first words, you get a sense of the driving force that has brought them to this point. And it occurred to me that this message by the Apostle Paul in Acts 13, it's an inaugural address of sorts. You see, up until recently in the text, Paul has been the sidekick. In fact, he was going by his Jewish name, Saul. But now he's taken the lead. Barnabas has stepped back out of the way and encouraged him to do so. And Saul starts being called by his Roman name, Paulus or Paul. And here they are in the middle of the synagogue. That's a gathering of mostly Jewish men, but some God-fearing Greeks or Gentiles as well. And Barnabas defers to this younger man, Paul, and Paul stands to speak. And it's interesting that he stands to speak. I don't know if you caught that or not, but most rabbis, they sat and taught. That's what Jesus did when he was in the synagogue. And I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, but I suspect that Paul stands to speak because he doesn't want anyone to think he's assuming the role of rabbi. Now, for any of you who know Paul, you'll know that it won't take long for him to get comfortable in that role as great teacher. But here's the great apostle Paul, but it's before he's written half the New Testament, and it's before he's ricocheted through this life for Jesus, and before he started those churches and led all those people to Jesus and set down in words so much of the substance of our faith. It's before all of that when he stands to speak, and I doubt that he even realizes what a big deal this first recorded message is. But obviously, Dr. Luke, the writer of Acts, does. That's why I think it's here in a fuller length than expected. And so I invite you to look at this inaugural address, these first words recorded, the first message of the Apostle Paul. Let's go back and start with where Miss Doris read so beautifully in Acts chapter 13, starting with verse 16. So Paul stood and he lifted his hand to quiet them, and he started speaking. Men of Israel, he said, and you God-fearing Gentiles, listen to me. The God of this nation of Israel chose our ancestors and made them multiply and grow strong during their stay in Egypt. Then with a powerful arm, he led them out of their slavery, and he put up with them through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Then he destroyed 7 nations in Canaan and gave their land to Israel as an inheritance, and all this took about 450 years. After that, God gave them judges to rule until the time of Samuel the prophet. Now, this synagogue that Paul is speaking in here, in case you've forgotten, it's in Antioch of Pisidia. Pisidia is a region in what is Turkey today. So when Paul says, men of Israel and you God-fearing Gentiles, it would help if you envision a decent-sized group of Turks, of Turkish men, some with the dress of Turkish Jews and some with the dress of regular Turks who have a healthy fear of God. See, these aren't necessarily wealthy fellows, but there is nothing to suggest to us that they live in abject poverty either. And in Paul's first salvo, by calling them men of Israel, what he's doing is he's attaching them to the history of their people in Judah. See, it would be like if I said to you, men and women of Africa. Well, those of you who have ancestry in Africa, you would perk up. And inside, there would be something in you that immediately made a connection with your heritage. Well, that's kind of what he's doing here when he says men of Israel. Even though they're far away from Judah, he is saying this so that they can make that connection. That's what Paul does here, which will prove to be a brilliant piece of communication. And then what he does is he recounts some of the history of the people of Israel. And interestingly enough, Paul doesn't start with where every good Jew would expect him to start. You see, if you read those first words of Paul, he throws probably everybody who's listening to him off kilter. See, he keeps their attention, I think, by confusing them about where he's headed. He starts his lesson in history in verse 17, and just check this out. I think you'll find it interesting. The God of this nation of Israel chose our ancestors and made them multiply and grow strong during their stay in Egypt. Now, he starts off just fine. He starts with Jewish exceptionalism. Now, you and I were familiar with that. We often speak of the U.S. as being the greatest nation in the world. When we talk with such language, that's an example of what we call U.S. exceptionalism. Simply put, we think we are exceptional, that we're better than everyone else. Well, that's pretty much what the Jews are accustomed to hearing. And so Paul starts with the God of this nation chose our ancestors. We are exceptional. We are chosen by God. Everything starts just as expected. The leaders of the synagogue might even be thinking, that's a strong start for a young man. Keep going. But then Paul says, God chose our ancestors and made them grow strong in the land of Egypt. And you can picture every person in the room going, what? What did he just say? Now, for those of you not familiar with the retelling of Israel's history with God, if it doesn't include events from the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the creation and Adam and Eve and the flood, then if you're hearing someone tell you the history of the Israelites, then it surely picks up by Genesis chapter 12, when God introduces himself to a fellow who will become known as Father Abraham. That's almost where every single retelling of Israel's history begins. Abraham, he's always the starting point, except in Paul's first words. And so then maybe you think, well, if you don't start with Abraham, then you surely start with Isaac or Esau and Jacob. And if you don't do Jacob, then you don't get to tell how he wrestled with God and how God gave him a new name called Israel. And that's where the nation gets its name, is from Jacob becoming this guy named Israel. And the country Israel is named after the guy who happens to have 12 sons. You see, each one of those sons becomes their own tribe. That's where you get the 12 tribes of Israel that you hear people go on about. And so you think, well, if he's not going to mention the patriarchs, if he's not going to mention Abraham and Isaac and Esau and Jacob becoming Israel, then surely at least he'll start with Joseph, right? I mean, if you want to do a history of Israel, you got to start at least with Joseph. I mean, after all, if it weren't for Joseph, Israel and his clan wouldn't even be relocated to Egypt. I mean, you got to talk about Joseph. I mean, for those of you who don't know, if you read the book of Genesis, it's got 50 chapters in it. The last 13 chapters are dedicated to Joseph. But no, when you read that first sentence or two of Paul's, nope, there's no mention of Joseph either. And then Paul, who, by the way, is a Hebrew scholar, he keeps going and he skips past a fellow by the name of Moses. He doesn't even mention Moses in the history of Israel. And if you're Jewish, and I can assure you, then you've heard of a fellow named Moses. And you have definitely heard of the most told story in all of Israel's long history, right? That's the story of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. And yeah, Paul doesn't mention that either. You're seeing what I'm seeing, right? Does anyone else think that's odd? And before you think, well, maybe Dr. Luke, the historian, was running out of space and he needed to edit some stuff out. Well, if that's what he edited out, that would be kind of like me trying to tell you the history of the presidents of the United States by starting with Millard Fillmore. Yes, he really was a president. He's got a brandy named after him. Just Google him. You'll see he really was a president. Seriously, it's like me talking to you about America's space program and forgetting to mention Al Shepard, John Glenn, and Neil Armstrong. Not elaborating on the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt is like me telling you the history of slavery in America and leaving out lynchings, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, and the Civil Rights Movement. All Paul says about the Exodus, then with a powerful arm, God led them out of slavery. That's all he says. The Exodus is the pinnacle of the Jewish faith. You see, there are two true mountains in the Hebrew faith, and the first one is the Exodus, and the other one is the coming of the Messiah. That's what you got, the two true moments in all of Hebrew faith. And Paul gives less than 10 Greek words on the subject. Unless you think there's a hole in Paul's knowledge, I can assure you that everything he left out, he'll use masterfully to teach, to illustrate, to illuminate our faith in his writing and his teaching in the years to come. But just for a moment, because it really is interesting, look at this again. Paul is doing something in these opening lines, this history of Israel that we haven't seen much of, and you haven't seen it all in the book of Acts up to this point. Just listen to these words again. The God of this nation of Israel chose our ancestors and made them multiply and grow strong during their stay in Egypt. Then with powerful arm, he led them out of their slavery. He put up with them for 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and then he destroyed 7 nations in Canaan and gave their land to Israel as an inheritance, and all this took about 450 years. After that, God gave them judges to rule until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people begged for a king, and God gave them Saul, son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, who reigned for 40 years. But God removed Saul, and he replaced him with David, a man about whom God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. And it is one of the King of David's descendants, Jesus, who is God's promised Savior of Israel. You see, Paul is talking with a group of people who have never heard the good news about Jesus before. They've never heard the good news about Jesus. And so you know what he does when he starts by telling their history to them again? He sidesteps most everything that they think they know, that they have down pat, and he tells them the story of Israel and Israel's God and the people of the world in a new way. You see, he doesn't focus on the patriarchs or bondage and slavery or the Exodus or the giving of the law or of God's 2 friends, Abraham and Moses. He doesn't talk about the Ark of the Covenant or the tabernacle or the temple. He doesn't mention most of what these people in the audience already know by rote. He skips all of that. And I'm personally convinced that he does it because he knows that his audience thinks that they have heard it all before. And so what he does is he rotates the story about 180 degrees so they see it from a different perspective. What you'll notice when you read slowly through those first few verses, that he tells them the same story, but he helps them to see that this story is not about them. It's not about their patriarchs. It's not about their suffering and hardships. It's not about their heroes. They're brave and bold and fearless. It's about God. I mean, just look at those verses again. This is what Paul says. He says, God chooses them as a nation. God caused them to multiply and grow strong, even in Egypt of all places. God delivered them. God led them. God was patient with them when he put up with them for 40 years. God gave them their land. God gave them their judges. God gave prophets with Samuel. God even gave them a king because they wanted one. And then God replaced that king and gave them a king after his own heart. And then the God who is identified through the Hebrew Bible as the Savior of the Israelites, and that's really important for you to know, throughout all of the Hebrew Bible, throughout all of the Old Testament, if you want to know who the Savior of the Israelites is, it is the Creator God. There's no question, there's no doubt. So this God who is known as the Savior of the Israelites gives them a descendant of their preeminent King David. His name is Jesus. He is God's Messiah. And Paul knocks the wind out of them by saying, this man, Jesus, is God's promised Savior of Israel. And of course, as so often happens, we have to stop here. Unfortunately, Luke, he didn't write the book of Acts for preachers or teachers to tackle it in 30-minute segments, I'm afraid. So I'll just have to pause the button. But if there were three things just from this little conversation, I would hope you would take from this text so far. It would be these three truths. The first one is, there are a lot of ways to tell a story. As a church, we're simply trying to find new ways to tell the story to people who think they've heard it all before and there's nothing new for them to hear. But not only that, we're trying to tell the story about Jesus, the Savior and his kingdom, and we're trying to tell a new story about our community. And we're trying to tell a new story for our girls and our boys so that we won't continue to hear the same tired, wicked, destructive story over and again. And you need to know that telling those stories isn't easy. Telling those stories takes courage, and it takes tenacity, and it takes resilience, and it takes faith, and it takes love. And the second thing I would tell you, the second truth I hope you hold on to, is that we cannot afford to be thrown off course. The story has always been about God. Always. Not you, and certainly not me. It will always be about God. And any other focus in the story will become distorted. And here's my third truth, and I don't know if it'll help or not. But as far as pain and suffering and loss and death and tragedy and wickedness are concerned, I don't have any easy answers. All I know to tell you is that the story isn't finished. and that you and me, we're not home yet. And so until we get home, I'm going to keep telling the same story in a new way. And I hope you think about that.